All righty. I'd like to start tonight by reminding all of you about a character in the Old Testament. His name was Joseph. We actually looked at him here a couple of months ago or so. But I just want to go over quickly, if I can, everything that happened in his life. He was his father's favorite son, which obviously made him the least favorite amongst all of his brothers, and he had 11 of them. They got tired of him getting all of the attention and all the breaks and all the cool gifts, if you will. So one day, while they were out working in the fields, they devised this plan, or more like a scheme. They sold him into slavery. They split up the money amongst themselves, and they told their father that he had been attacked by a wild animal. And his father, of course, was devastated. These nomadic tribes that were traveling around, these slave traders, ended up taking Joseph to Egypt, where he wound up as a slave in the household of Potiphar, who was a high-ranking governmental official. Joseph did his job with great skill, and Potiphar was very pleased with him. Before long, however, Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph and made some inappropriate advances in his direction. Joseph politely declined her offer and then made a beeline for the door. Mrs. Potiphar, who didn't take rejection very well at all, accused Joseph of unslave-worthy actions and behavior, and he was quickly then tossed in jail. While he was in prison, he had the opportunity to help a fellow inmate who happened to work closely with Pharaoh. Joseph interpreted a dream for the man, and years later, when Pharaoh himself had some dreams, some puzzling dreams, this man remembered Joseph, and he suggested that he might be able to help Pharaoh understand the meaning of his dreams. Well, Joseph did indeed interpret the dreams, telling Pharaoh that there would be 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of a global famine. In an interesting turn of events, Pharaoh said, everything that you've said makes sense. So I'm going to put you in charge of helping us prepare for the hard times that are coming. And sure enough, after 7 years of prosperity, the famine hit, and Egypt was ready, thanks to Joseph's foresight and his excellent administrative skills. Everyone throughout the entire world was affected, including Joseph's family back in Canaan. That included his father and his brothers who had sold him into slavery. These brothers then came to Egypt hoping to find food and wound up in a face-to-face meeting with Joseph. Now, of course, they didn't recognize him after all of these years, and they certainly didn't expect to run into him in this kind of a situation. But Joseph recognized them. After a little back and forth, he eventually told them who he was. And they were able to clear the air, and Joseph arranged for them all to come and live with him in Egypt, where he provided for all of them. Years later, after his father died, the brothers were afraid that Joseph would take this opportunity to get his revenge. But he didn't. Instead, look at what he said in Genesis 50, verse 20. Genesis 50, verse 20. It says, "You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." In Joseph's story, we see how God can take even the worst circumstances and use them for good. We're in the process here on Wednesday nights of looking at some of the promises of God. The story of Joseph illustrates the promise that we're going to be looking at tonight, which is, for God's people, everything works out for the best every time. Now, maybe today you have a good reason to doubt the truth of this promise. There may be things going on in your life that you don't understand, things that make you want to ask, why, God? And at times, that's a very reasonable question to ask. Sometimes, as in Joseph's case, we'll see the story resolve itself in such a way that we're able to understand why things happened the way they did. And we're able to recognize the good that came out of it. However, sometimes, to be honest, we won't see the immediate resolution to the story. But you can be sure of this. If you allow Him to, God will take whatever happens in your life and work it out for the best. Like all of God's promises, this begins with a commitment of faith on your part, a decision to put your trust in Him, in spite of how things may appear. You can call it hope, you can call it optimism, but it's this attitude that will sustain you through life's most difficult circumstances. German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about this attitude when he said this: the essence of optimism is that it takes no account of the present, but it is a source of inspiration, of vitality and hope where others have resigned. It enables a man to hold his head high, to claim the future for himself, and not to abandon it to his enemy. I want you to know that it is possible to live that way, with your eyes focused not on the present circumstances, not on what's going on around you, but on the promise of God's faithfulness, that in His time, He will make it all make sense. In the movie As Good as It Gets, Jack Nicholson plays the part of this unstable, somewhat neurotic writer who lives in constant emotional turmoil. And at one point in the film, as he's leaving his psychiatrist's office, he stops in the waiting room. And in this room, it is filled with other patients who certainly know firsthand about the troubling nature of life. And he asks this question: what if this is as good as it gets? It's a discouraging thought for a lot of folks, that life will never be better than it is right now. But that's not at all true. The promise of Scripture is just the opposite. This isn't as good as it gets, because the best is yet to come. The circumstances of life may be dreary today, but the situation is certainly better than it seems. If for no other reason than for this reason: the situation that you're in today is only temporary, and the best is yet to come. So let's read this promise. Look at Romans 8, verses 28 and 29. Romans 8, verses 28 and 29. It says, "We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to His purpose. For those He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, so that He would be the firstborn among many brothers." This evening, I want us to take some time to think about what it means to live in anticipation of this promise, that all things work together for good. There are three related truths that I want you to consider. First of all, we need to keep in mind that this promise doesn't apply to everyone. Paul says specifically in Romans 8:28, in the very first part of that, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God. There's this new agey kind of idea that often gets floated around that tells you that everything happens for a reason and good will come out of it. But frankly, that may not be the case. Not if you're living a life of rebellion and making one self-destructive decision after another. Good won't come out of that, because good can't come out of that. You can't live outside of the will of God, making no effort to change, and be able to expect that in the end everything is going to turn out okay. In fact, though I hate to say it, the truth is that for those who live outside the will of God, the answer to Jack Nicholson's question is, yeah, this probably is about as good as it's going to get. That's because this promise doesn't apply to everyone. But you can get in on it whenever you're ready. How? By turning your heart to God, by surrendering yourself to do His will. And when you do this, then He begins the process of putting the pieces of your life into place. This applies to those who have never called themselves Christians and who have never made an effort to faithfully follow Jesus Christ. When you surrender your life to Him, He'll make something beautiful out of your life. He will, by His mercy and His grace, work all things together for your good. This also applies to the believers here among us. And I use that word us, who have gone through seasons in which we've stumbled off of the straight and narrow and took our eyes off of Jesus and began to focus only on ourselves, and who ultimately made a giant mess of things around us. When you answer the wake-up call and you get your heart back to where it needs to be, Jesus begins the process of putting the pieces of your life back in place as well. This promise that God works all things together for good may not apply to everyone, but it can apply to you if you're ready to put it to work in your life. Surrender yourself once again to the lordship of Christ and to the will of God. Another related truth that we need to keep in mind is this promise doesn't imply that everything that happens in your life is good. Not everything that happens in your life is good. That's an important distinction to remember. There's a difference between saying everything that happens is good or saying that God will make good come out of any situation. The second part of that statement is absolutely true, 100% of the time. The first part clearly isn't. Not everything that happens is good, and no amount of Pollyannism is going to make it good. Sometimes ugly things happen. Along those same lines, we need to recognize that not everything that happens is within the boundaries of God's will. In fact, there are many things that happen every day that specifically aren't the will of God. For example, 2 Peter 3:9 says, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. That's His will. And yet every day, people enter into eternity without knowing Christ, without ever having repented. It is never God's will that you sin. It is never God's will that anyone else should sin. It is never God's will that a child should ever be abused, or that people should be oppressed, or that evil should in any way win, even if only for a moment. Those who abuse and oppress and do evil are never doing God's will. One of the cold, hard realities of living in this world is that sometimes one person will bear the brunt of the sinful actions of another person. We see this in every level of society, from government leadership down to the community level and into each individual home. It's not fair and it's not right. But you never have to tell yourself that this is happening because of God's will. You can, however, tell yourself, and you can build your life on this promise, that God will take this situation that is in no way good and make something good come out of it if those involved love God. Joseph is a good example. God didn't cause all the bad things that happened to Joseph. Evil people did. But God was at work in the details to make something good come out of it. Another example is the Apostle Paul. God didn't put Paul in prison. The godless Roman authorities did that. But God used the situation to inspire Paul to write letters. The very letters that help us today in living the Christian life. A while back, I came across a tweet that kind of made me chuckle. Back in the early days of the pandemic, a young woman named Jamie wrote this: "My overprotective mother just told me this lockdown is God's way of telling me I go out too much. Sorry, everybody, this entire pandemic is my fault for not staying at home." Okay? Now, God didn't start the pandemic to teach Jamie a lesson. I don't actually believe that God started the pandemic, period. But we've seen how God has used the pandemic to help some people reevaluate their lives. He used the pandemic to show parents what was actually being taught to their children in classrooms. He's used the pandemic to help churches focus on new methods of outreach and ministry. God isn't behind the negative events that occur in our lives, but He can use them in such a way that good will come out of it. Oftentimes, we have the advantage of being able to see just how it all works together for good. However, sometimes, and quite frankly, it's not quite so apparent. And we ask ourselves, what good could possibly come out of this tragedy, out of this disaster, out of this heartbreak? We don't always see how it could possibly work out for good. But I'll tell you my perspective on the matter. And I've seen it happen often enough in stories like Joseph and so many others, and certainly in my own life, that God makes something good come out of a devastating situation. So that when I don't understand why this is happening, and I can't see the benefit of the ultimate outcome, I can still trust in Him. Because I know that God is good, and He wants the best for His people. And He gives the best to His people, even then the world has dealt us the very worst. While Corrie ten Boom was living in a German concentration camp, her entire body became infested with lice, making an unimaginable situation even worse. She was complaining about it one day, and her sister reminded her of the Bible verse that says, "In everything give thanks." And she challenged Corey to give thanks for the lice. Corey's response was, "How can I give thanks to God for lice?" But she made a choice to do it anyway. Years later, she found out that the lice had actually protected her from the assaults of the German officers and soldiers. When something bad happens, you don't have to try to trick yourself into saying, "Oh, this is so good. This is great. This is wonderful." That's just being dishonest. But you can say, "Yes, this is a bad situation, but I can thank God in spite of it, because I know that He can make something good out of it." And what exactly will He make out of it? We see the answer to that in Romans 8:29. "For those He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son." And that brings us to our third point. God's plan for you in each and every situation is that you will become more like Jesus. And in this, God has something of a one-track mind. The situation itself might not be good, but a very specific good can come out of it. You will be more like Jesus. And when you become more like Jesus, who wins? Everybody wins. You win because you've grown closer to God and you have more of Him in your life and more of His power at work in your life. Your spouse wins, your children win, your employer and your friends, everyone you know. The more you become like Christ, the greater impact for good you'll have in the lives of those around you. The more you become like Christ, the more you will experience the abundant life that He promised. The life of joy and peace and love and fulfillment. The more your life will be a blessing to other people. This is God's single-minded purpose for each one of us. That we will be like Jesus. And everything that happens in your life can work toward that end when you're surrendered to Him. I'm not a person who likes to reread a book. There are books that I read when I was younger. I read The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books and many other books when I was younger. And I love reading. I read books all the time. But I don't like rereading the same book. For me, it's boring. I just don't like to do it. However, the same cannot be said about me and movies. I enjoy watching movies that I've seen before. And in some ways, I enjoy watching them the second time even more than I did the first time. And I think that's because I already know how it's going to turn out. And when I know how a movie is going to end, I don't have to get all tensed up at the scenes when I don't know how the characters are going to get out of danger. I don't have to be on edge wondering if one of my favorite characters might die. Because I already know how the whole movie is going to end. So I can simply sit back and enjoy the whole movie. Enjoy some of the subtleties that are in the movie. I can pay more attention to the musical score and how they use that to bring in the drama and some of the intenseness of the movie. I can pay more attention to the cinematography that's being used, and other things that make the movie great. Because I know how the story is going to end. I'm able to enjoy the movie for its pure artistic value. I would imagine John has seen some John Wayne movies 5 or 6 times. And he enjoys them every time. Even though he knows how the movie is going to end. He knows everything that's going to happen. But he still enjoys it. The promise of Romans 8:28 and 29 is much the same. Not to minimize the serious nature of the hard times that we face, but just as we know the outcome of a movie that we've already seen, we can know in advance of life's challenges that God will cause every difficult situation that we face, every tragedy, every trauma, to work out for good somehow, some way in our lives, if we're fully surrendered to Him. And when it comes to the details of your daily life, God has a one-track mind. He wants you to become like Jesus. That's His ultimate goal. And that goal will not only bring good to you, but it will bring good to all those around you. Like Joseph, and the way God used his situation to save an entire nation. That's why Dietrich Bonhoeffer said what he did. Believing the promise of Romans 8:28 and 29 enables you to hold your head high and claim the future for yourself. God can make sense of that which doesn't seem to make sense. And when you surrender yourself to Him, you will hear Him say, just see what I can do. Just see what I can make out of this. Take out your prayer sheets, if you would. You can